So welcome to the first actual lesson of this course, and we'll be talking about event tracking in Google Tag Manager. And we'll be really going under the hood this time, because when we talk about event tracking, it's not just about creating GA events, if that's what you're confusing it with, but it's about how the message queue of the data layer works in Google Tag Manager, and how that feeds information into the triggering mechanism of Google Tag Manager. So we'll be talking a little bit about how Google Tag Manager handles this message queue, how it processes those messages in order, and how it outputs those into tags, variables, and triggers in Google Tag Manager. So if you're ready to go, follow me. Let's take a closer look at how event tracking works in Google Tag Manager.
This lesson is titled Event Tracking Under the Hood. And in here, we'll talk about how Google Tag Manager uses the data layer array and its push method to introduce items you or the website or GTM pushes into the data layer and integrate those into its own data structure. We'll also talk about how GTM handles event tracking using its own auto event triggers like the click trigger and the form submission trigger. And we'll talk about what kind of issues might emerge due to how GTM has decided to utilize something called event propagation for its event tracking model. So the objectives of this lesson are to understand how a data layer push works, what the mechanism is that GTM uses to pull that information into its own data model. We'll learn about auto event tracking and about how things like click and just links triggers operate on the document node to introduce some optimization into and economics into how GTM deploys triggers on the website. And finally, we'll talk about what kind of issues emerge with event propagation and what kind of workarounds there might be. So this is useful, especially if you've tried to create a just links trigger that just doesn't work, or if you've tried to create a form submission trigger that doesn't actually fire when a form is submitted. Just to quickly look where we are in the curriculum, this is the first actual lesson of the course. It will be followed by a lesson about custom event listeners. So these two go hand in hand. We'll take the theory we learn in this event tracking under the hood lesson, and we'll use that in the next lesson where we'll create our own custom event listener. So this lesson is slightly longer because we're going through a lot of theory before jumping into the practical stuff in the next lesson. But nevertheless, I recommend going through this lesson diligently because there's a lot of stuff that's kind of bubbling under the hood that will be helpful to you once you start to looking into how GTM's event tracking works. So without further ado, let's jump right into the subject matter. Talk about how a data layer push works in GTM. So the data layer is essentially a global data structure in JavaScript. Global in the browser JavaScript universe means that it's accessible from any JavaScript running on the page. So third-party JavaScript libraries that have been downloaded on the page, JavaScript running in GTM and JavaScript running outside GTM all have access to the global namespace of the browser page. Naturally, iframes are their own sandboxes, so they don't have access to the page where the iframe is embedded in unless the iframe is running on the same domain and there's some different types of accessors used. So, but we won't talk about iframes here because I don't want to bum you out with them. But so the data layer structure is global, so it can always be accessed with the window prefix. And I really recommend to always use the window prefix when working with global items because it helps developers and others looking at your code to realize that you are actually talking about a global data structure rather than a locally scoped one. So try to always remember to add the window prefix whenever working with data layer. Data layer itself is an array, so it's a list type data structure in JavaScript where you can push items, and each item you push gets added to this queue. So in the screenshot, you can see that there are 4 items pushed into the data layer queue, and the first item always has index number 0. So the first item that was pushed is this event object that has the value gtm.js and so on. So these 4 items were pushed in that particular order. So first, the item in index number 0, then the second item that was pushed is the item in index number 1, and so on. So the data layer being an array, it's communicated with using the push method. The thing about the push method in GTM is that GTM's container actually overwrites the push method, and it basically hijacks it and attaches its own little push listener into that push method. So even though the push method still does its job wonderfully, it pushes the item into the array, and thus, the browser API for the array actually works as expected. GTM adds its own little listener to the push method, which copies everything that was pushed into the array, and it translates them into its own internal data structure. And this is what we'll be focusing on much of this lesson. The thing about the push method being overridden means that in case you run code on the website that actually resets the data layer back to a native array, so using something like data layer equals something, you risk breaking GTM, because by reinitializing data layer as a regular array, you revert the push method back to its original native implementation, in which case GTM's push listener will no longer work, and GTM, which really, the data layer push mechanism is so fundamental to GTM that you'll break things like click listeners, and all the GTM's native triggers will stop working. So never ever reinitialize the data layer after it's been created. Always communicate with it with using the push method. Here you can see how the pushed object actually has two key value pairs. The first key is named event, and the value is custom event. And there's a special thing about the event key in the data layer push, in that the event key is the only thing that can trigger a tag. No triggers will fire if the data layer push did not have an event key. So if the data layer push only had this key some value pair, no triggers would be able to fire with this data layer push. So that's why it's also a kind of a good practice to always have a placeholder event key in every single data layer push, in case you run across a situation where you really need to trigger something off that particular data layer push. Let's take a practical look at how the data layer array can feed information into GTM's own internal data structure. And the best way to test this is to have a page with GTM running in preview mode, because in preview mode you have this data layer tab here that's really fundamental to understanding how this whole thing works. So before we jump to that tab, let's take a look at what the data layer array itself looks like. So this is the array. It has 5 items of different composition, and these are the items being pushed in order into the data layer. So from top to bottom, that's the order in which they were introduced into data layer. So let's push something new. Let's push a key called user ID with value 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oops. Like this, and see what happens. First of all, in the data layer, you can now see that there's a new item at the very end called with user ID key and the value 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And here, when we click to the data layer tab, we can see that the item that was pushed into data layer has the key user ID and the value 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And now, importantly, the data layer values after this message also have user ID 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And this object here, the data layer values after this message, that is the representation of Google Tag Manager's internal data structure. This is what the data layer variable in GTM uses. It's not an array, it's a lookup table where there are keys such as gtm.start, gtm.unique event ID, and so on, and user ID. And when you create a data layer variable, it checks the table what the most recent value for that data layer variable key is. So if I now were to create a variable for user ID, it would return the value of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So let's then push something else into data layer. Let's push user ID 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now, when you look at the data layer array itself, you can see that it has both 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If you have this message number 6 selected, it will still show you what the contents of that message were and what the value was and what the value of data layer value internal data structure was. But when you look at the most recent message that was pushed, there's a new value for user ID, which overwrites the value in GTM's internal data structure as well. And this is important to understand because it means that GTM's data layer variables don't have memory. There's no way to create a data layer variable that says, fire this tag if the user ID is now 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but if it used to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, only then fire the tag. So GTM only has access to the most recent value for any key. If you want to know the history of the data layer values, you will have to look into the data layer array itself. But this is kind of risky because any code on the site can actually remove items from the array. So by running the pop command twice, we actually removed the user ID keys from the array. And now here's the second really important thing. Even though I removed them from the array, they are still available in GTM's internal data structure. So the data layer array is actually completely separated from GTM. GTM only uses that array as a message queue. And that queue pushes messages into GTM, but GTM copies those messages. So if the original message is removed from the data layer array, it will still stay in GTM. And that's really important to understand. And that's why GTM only listens to the push command. So only by using the push command will you trigger anything in GTM's internal data structure. Using the pop command did nothing, shift will do nothing, splice will do nothing, and so on. So this is how GTM uses the data layer array to update its internal keys so that your data layer variables will always have access to the most recent key value pair in the data model. So you probably saw in preview mode that there's a bunch of different messages below the summary in the list of items in the what have you pushed into data layer. And the list of items is ascending. So the item with number 1, which is page view here right now, means that it was the first thing that was pushed into data layer. Custom.navigation was the second thing that was pushed, and so on. The items circled in red are GTM's default events. If you don't see those in preview mode, your container is broken. It's very important to always find these items in the data in the preview mode and in data layer, because otherwise it means that you have some code on the side overriding GTM's data layer, which means that it will most likely break your auto event tracking and many other things as well. The page view event is pushed in the container snippet itself, and it fires as soon as the container has loaded. It's very often the very first thing that is pushed into data layer, so it should almost always be with number 1 in this list of items. But there's nothing stopping you from adding stuff into data layer before the container snippet, for example, an enhanced e-commerce object, in which case that object would actually have number 1 and page view would be number 2. DOM ready is pushed when the page HTML has been rendered by the browser. So when the browser has completely finished reading the HTML document itself returned by the web server, that's when the DOM ready event is pushed into data layer by GTM. The thing is that the container takes a while to load, so it's actually very common to have page view and DOM ready enter data layer almost immediately at the same time. And this is just simply because it's very common to have the container load after the document object model has been signaling its ready status. So DOM ready is pushed when the page HTML has been rendered in the browser. And it's a good trigger event to use whenever you need to refer to something in the page HTML. For example, when you just scrape a title of the page or something like that, the DOM ready event is a good one to use. Window loaded is pushed into data layer as soon as the page has completely loaded. So all the resources, images, asynchronous requests, JavaScript libraries, all of those have completely loaded. So that's a good trigger event to use whenever you need to use an external resource of which you don't really know when it completes its loading. Then you'll see things like click and form submit and link click and element visibility. And these are all GTM's automatically collected user interaction events. They'll appear in the data layer with these kinds of labels like click, which is a bit confusing. I would prefer they would use their original event names, but you'll just have to learn which ones are automatically collected events and which ones are GTM's default events and which ones are custom events that your own code can push into data layer. So in this example, custom.navigation and non-idle are custom events pushed by my own JavaScript code with a data layer push that has the event key set to, non-idle or custom.navigation. So you can use custom data layer pushes to fire your triggers upon certain interactions that GTM doesn't automatically track. So they're a very powerful way of adding some flexibility to your setups. And then finally, you have the message, which is a data layer push without an event key. Or anecdotally, it can also be a data layer push with an event key whose value is message. And that's really confusing. So don't ever do that. I've come across it a couple of times and I've never understood why that happens, why somebody chooses that confusing name as their event value, because it's really difficult to look at a glance at the event list and see which ones are then data layer pushes without event keys and which ones are data layer pushes with event keys. But the key thing about the message is that it has no triggering capabilities of its own. So it can't be used to trigger tags in your container. So the next thing that we'll jump into is how GTM uses auto event tracking and how it listens to different user interactions on the page. And auto event tracking is one of the most powerful features of Google Tag Manager. It lets you deploy these no-code solutions for tracking things like user clicks, user scrolling down the page, user watching a YouTube video, which traditionally have required quite a bit of developer intervention. So using auto event tracking is a great way to leverage GTM's native event tracking capabilities. And here's the list of GTM's native event trackers at the time when this video was created. So you can see that there's the all elements trigger for the click. The all elements trigger listens to any kind of click on the page, and the element that it returns, it pushes into dataLayer, is the actual element that was clicked. So depending on what's directly underneath the mouse when a click happens, the all elements trigger will fire its trigger for that particular element. The just links trigger is a bit different. It also listens for clicks on the page, but it only pushes an item into dataLayer if that clicked element was wrapped by a link. So a link element is an anchor element with the letter A representing its HTML tag name. And when a click happens on an element that is wrapped by an anchor, GTM actually climbs up to the nearest link element and pushes that into dataLayer as the target of the click. So this means that if you want to track clicks on links, always try the just links trigger first, because that's the kind of most robust way to track link clicks. Also because it lets you do things like halt the page to wait for all the tags to complete before the redirect happens. But there are situations where the just links trigger won't work with certain types of links, and we'll talk about those later in the video, in which case you might need to use the all elements trigger for links as well. Element visibility trigger uses a couple of APIs. It uses the mutation observer API and the intersection observer API, and then it just polls the page periodically, waiting for a specific element to become visible in the viewport. So the element visibility trigger can be used to fire events and tags whenever a specific element becomes visible in the page. And this is useful for things like modal pop-ups and alert pop-ups, or form submission validation errors that pop up, which you can use with the visibility trigger to trigger whenever they become visible. The form submission trigger listens for the submit event. So when an HTML form is actually submitted, so a button with the type submit is clicked, the form submission trigger fires. Unfortunately, it's one of the most difficult triggers to get working right, because there are so many JavaScript libraries out there that actually manipulate how the form submit event is triggered. And more often than not, they actually cancel the form submission event completely. And then GTM's trigger will never capture those form submissions. But we'll talk about that as well in the latter part of this video. The scroll depth trigger listens for scrolling. So when you scroll down the page, you can listen for the user scrolling to 25%, 50%, 75% of the page, and so on. So it's great for content engagement tracking. The YouTube video trigger listens for your progression in a YouTube video. The custom event trigger I already mentioned, so it listens for the dataLayer push with an event key that you've created by yourself. It's an extremely powerful trigger for your own custom interaction tracking. The history change trigger listens for manipulations of the history API. So in case it's a single page app, for example, it's common to have the page URL change without a page load happening. And this is typically done with a history API event, such as push state or replace state. And the history change trigger will fire whenever one of these history API manipulations takes place. JavaScript error triggers are fired whenever an uncaught JavaScript exception happens on the page. So uncaught means that there's no JavaScript that's trying to catch the error. And instead the error is allowed to happen, and the browser throws the error. So this trigger fires whenever that happens. It's a great way to measure browser errors on your page. The timer trigger can be set to fire whenever a certain interval of time has passed since the container was loaded. It's very commonly used as a kind of interaction heartbeat. I wouldn't recommend to use it for that, but it's commonly used to, for example, when the user has been 30 seconds on the page, send some kind of non-bounce heartbeat event to GA. And finally, the trigger group can be used to combine different triggers together. So you can have a tag fire only when a form submission trigger and a click trigger have fired. Or you can say that don't fire a tag before the user has scrolled to 75%, and they've spent 30 seconds on the page. So combining a scroll trigger with a timer trigger. So the trigger group can be used for that kind of combinations. So on this page, I have a handful of GTM's auto event triggers firing, just to show you how they interact with the data layer in different ways. So let's take a look at the most prototypical one, which is the click trigger. And I just have a simple all elements trigger firing on this page. So when you look at the items that are pushed into dataLayer for a click trigger, you can see that there's the event name is gtm.click. The element, gtm.element, returns the actual HTML element that was the target of the click, which would be whatever div was underneath the mouse button here. Element classes returns if that element had anything in the class attribute, the HTML class attribute. And this particular element did have something. It had the post value. ID would return anything in the HTML ID attribute, which this element did not have. Element target would return the value of the target attribute, which especially links can often have, such as target blank for links that open in a new window. And element URL returns the link redirection target of the link, if it's a link element, or the form action, so what the form redirect will be after a successful submission. So these 5 keys are typically included in almost all the auto event triggers, and they correspond with some built-in variables you can find in GTM that you can configure and activate through the built-in variables selection. So the click element is the same as gtm.element, returning the element that was clicked. Click classes is the value of the class attribute of the element. Click ID is the value of the ID attribute. Click target is the value of the target attribute. And click URL is the value of the URL attribute. The click text doesn't have a data layer representation. It just returns the text content of the clicked element. Importantly, these click variables are exactly the same as these form variables. So you might just as well use only one set. So only use the click variables. There's no need to activate also the form elements variables. And the other thing to note is that these click variables also work with the element visibility trigger. So when this element became visible, this hello text here, it fired the element visibility trigger, and you can see how there's the same keys, gtm.element, element classes, element ID, and so on. So you can use the click variables to make sure that your tag fires only when a specific element visibility event happened on a specific element. So the element visibility trigger also has some other attributes, such as visible ratio, which contains how many percentages of the element were visible when the trigger fired. And in this case, 100% of the element was visible. 100% of this hello element was visible. Visible time, first time and last time, measure the time the element was visible on the screen and when it first appeared and when it was last seen. This is typically 0 unless you've specified in the visibility trigger settings that you want the trigger to wait for the element to be visible for a certain amount of time. The gtm.triggers key is kind of interesting. It's used to disambiguate between different triggers that use the same event name. So if you had multiple element visibility triggers running on the page, they would generate just one element visibility event at a time. But this triggers key would be used to distinguish that the tag that uses this trigger would only fire when the hello element became visible. By using this triggers key, it wouldn't fire when the test page element became visible, even if I had another visibility trigger waiting for the test page element. So this triggers key basically tells the tag that only when the trigger ID 45 has been added to the tag is the tag allowed to fire. There's also a form submission trigger running on this page. So this is actually a form here. So when I enter some kind of address here and try to submit the form, you should see a form submit event appear here in preview mode. But as you can see, it didn't appear. And this is because there's some JavaScript running on this page that is actually blocking GTM's trigger, the form submit trigger, from working. And we'll get to that very shortly in this video, why this happens and how to prevent it. So just as a recap, different triggers push different types of stuff into the data layer, but most often they use these GTM namespaced data layer variables that you can also use with built-in variables. The gtm.element is a really special built-in variable because you can actually use it with a CSS selector to target any element on the page. So if I wanted to fire a link if I wanted to fire a click trigger whenever any heading element is clicked on the page, heading 1 element is clicked on the page, I could use click element matches CSS selector h2 asterisk. So this trigger would now fire whenever any h2 element is clicked or any descendant of an h2 element, such as a span. And this syntax, element, comma, element, asterisk, is quite important to use because it simply says that fire when the element is clicked, or if the element has nested elements within, still fire the trigger. So that's significant in cases where, for example, if you take a look at this hello element, let's say I wanted to fire the trigger when its parent main content wrap is clicked. So I would create a click trigger where fire when click classes equals main content wrap. But it won't work if the click happens on the h2, because in that case, the h2 element is the one that was clicked, not the parent. So by using a CSS selector with click element matches CSS selector main content wrap or main content wrap space asterisk, we're telling the trigger to fire whenever the element itself is clicked or any of its descendants. So that's a useful trick to use when working with the all elements trigger. So now it's time to jump a bit into theory, and this segues us into the last part of this lesson where we talk about issues with link click tracking. But the way that GTM actually adds things like click listeners and the form submit listener is that instead of adding it to individual elements, so the thing that you're looking at right now is a representation of the document object model. And it's basically a tree where you have top level elements that are then nested. They have nested elements within them. So the top level element of the entire web page is the window namespace. And the window namespace has a number of utility methods and global variables attached to it. And it also has the document object model, which is the HTML representation of your entire page, the dynamic representation of the HTML. From the HTML tag downwards, it's everything that's rendered from your page HTML and dynamically added by other JavaScript becomes part of the DOM tree. So the body element is descended from the HTML. Then there's a table, which has a table body, and it has 2 table rows. So 2 TR elements are descending from table body. And both of those table rows have 2 cells each. So 2 table cells each. And then those table cells have some text within them, like Shady Grove, Aeolian, and Dorian, and so on. And in this particular example, we have a click that falls on the table cell with the strong black outline. And GTM's listeners, rather than being added to the table cell itself, so rather than the listener listening for clicks on that table cell, the listener is added to the document node all the way up in the DOM tree. And this is because GTM uses something called event propagation to listen for any clicks or any form submissions that happen on the page. Regardless of where they happen, they always climb up to the document node to inform GTM that, hey, some element was clicked. And the browser enables this by using something called event propagation or event delegation. And this event tracking model comprises 3 different phases. The first phase is the capture phase, where the information that a click event happened starts climbing down from the top of the window tree all the way down to the element that was clicked. So the capture is the actual action of the mouse click falling on the table cell. When the mouse click happens, the event, basically the mouse click, is informed from the top down first that something happened on the table cell. Then the click happens, that's the target phase. And when the click has happened, then it starts climbing up or bubbling up all the way back to the top. So it does this kind of a loop, starting from the top, going down to the element that was actually the target of the event, and then climbing back up. And when the event is climbing up, information about what was the target of the event is kept intact in that propagation model. So that's how GTM knows when the TD element is clicked. Even though GTM's listeners all the way at the top of the DOM tree, that's how GTM knows that the table cell was clicked. And that's how GTM makes use of event delegation. GTM's alternative would be to add its event listener to every single element on the page, but that creates a lot of overhead in terms of programming, and it also introduces a race condition where, what about if you add elements dynamically to the page using JavaScript, for example? GTM wouldn't be able to add its listener to those dynamically added elements because it attaches its listeners when the container is first loaded. So you would end up with elements that GTM simply can't track because it doesn't have listeners attached to them. So by using event delegation like this, GTM is able to really economically listen for user interactions on the page. Unfortunately, one conclusion about this delegation model is that it introduces a specific way for other on-site JavaScript to break the delegation model. So if we look at this diagram again, and let's say the click has now happened on the table cell. And now let's say that on the table row, right above the table cell, there's JavaScript in place that prevents propagation from moving forward. And this is totally doable with JavaScript. I'll actually show you how it can be done. And it's fairly common, especially on sites that use jQuery. But the result is that the table row tells that, hey, I just learned that the table cell was clicked, but I don't want to inform anything above me in the tree anymore that something was clicked. So it basically stops the bubbling phase altogether. So none of these elements, all the way up to GTM's listeners on the document node, none of these elements will know that there was a click on the table cell. And thus GTM's link click trigger listener or form submission listener will not be able to detect interactions on those cells that are below these items that were blocked by JavaScript. So this is one of the main reasons why you might be trying to use a just links trigger or a form submission trigger, and it just doesn't fire off when GTM is using its native event trackers. So let's take a look at how these propagation issues actually manifest on the page itself. So I have a form here. This is just a simple form with a single input field and a submit button. We can verify that there indeed is a form element with the ID subscribe. It has an action of redirecting to a page with the query parameter thank you. It's using the post method. There's an email field here and then a submit button here. So if all things work, I also have a form submission trigger here set to fire when any form is submitted. So if all things work, when I write something into this input field and hit subscribe, there's a thank you message for the form. I should now see a form submit event in the preview mode, but I don't. So there's something on this page preventing GTM's form trigger from working. And in this particular example, I explicitly added some JavaScript to the page where I take the form element itself, the subscribe ID element, and I add a new event listener to it, which listens for the submit event. And in that event listener, I actually explicitly stop the propagation of the event object. So stop propagation when run against the event object basically halts that event from climbing up, bubbling up all the way to the document node where GTM's listeners are. So if you have troubles with your form trigger or your just links triggers, your first step is to talk to your developers, talk to them about the other JavaScript running on the site, and ask them, is there some code there that's preventing the propagation of the event to the top of the document? And if there is there something that could be done about it? This is actually kind of rare to see it directly used like this with stop propagation. The most common use case is that there's some jQuery running on the site. So jQuery is a very popular JavaScript framework. So there's jQuery running on the site, and there's a submit handler attached with jQuery, and then there's something done in that submit handler, and then the jQuery stops with return false. So the return false statement here in the jQuery callback actually conflates stop propagation and event prevent default into one command. So the return false makes it so that the default action of the submission is prevented. So that's the redirect to the thank you page. And the propagation of the event object is also stopped. So the return false is kind of a dangerous command. It's easy to use, but it's kind of dangerous for any analytics tracking or any event handling that is happening on the top of the document using event delegation. So if you do have jQuery running on the site, the easiest fix is to check if this might be enough. So instead of using return false, simply use event.prevent default, because this is most likely what the developer had in mind when implementing the handler. If you don't have jQuery running and you found where stop propagation is run, you can simply just try to comment it out and see what happens. So let's comment it out, and then let's refresh the container to see if the form submit tracking now actually works. So here we've reloaded the page. Let's put our email address there, hit submit. Now you can see that the form submit event actually appeared. So going through the code and finding all those situations where event stop propagation is being used, and either removing it or flipping it over to only use event prevent default, that's one way to do it. Obviously, it's a bit complicated way to do it. So the other way to do it, and this is actually the most robust way to handle form tracking, for example, is to have the developers, they can keep the event stop propagation right there, but have them also add a custom data layer push in the callback. So what they'll do is they'll add window data layer push event, form submit success, or some other message that notifies GTM that the form was submitted successfully. And then you can create a custom event trigger for this data layer push and fire tags when a form is successfully submitted. So that's probably the best way to do it. It does require that you communicate with your developers clearly. And there's a third way to do this as well, which is to create your own custom submit listener in a custom HTML tag, which uses the capture phase instead of the bubble phase, and kind of overcomes these propagation issues once and for all. And we'll talk about that in our next lesson, which covers custom event listeners. So just quickly going back to this diagram, the reason I mentioned using an all elements trigger instead of a just links trigger in case you have a problem with propagation is because the all elements trigger is special. It doesn't use the bubble phase, so it doesn't care if the bubbling phase propagation is stopped by other JavaScript. It actually uses the capture phase to track clicks. So it's more resilient to other on-site JavaScript from messing with your GTM's just links trigger. So in cases where the just links trigger doesn't work, use an all elements trigger instead with the CSS selection method, and you'll probably be able to track those link clicks much easier. The problem with the all elements trigger is that it doesn't have the wait for tags option, so it doesn't let you halt the page redirect until all tags have completed. So it's kind of a give and take, or a trade-off between getting more accurate tracking, but also maybe missing some hits due to the user being redirected away too fast. The form submission trigger does not have this kind of a capture-based selection method, even though I would love it to have that configuration. So in case the form submission trigger doesn't work, you will have to use either a custom data layer push, as I just showed, or look at the next lesson where we talk about custom event listeners. So you can actually create your own custom event listener that will work with the capture phase instead. So we've reached the end of this lesson, and let's just quickly go over what we've covered. We took a look at how the data layer push works, how it uses the data layer array structure to feed messages into its own internal data structure. We talked about auto event tracking. We talked about the different types of triggers running on the site, and we talked about the object that is being pushed into data layer whenever a native auto event trigger fires. We also talked about capturing and bubbling, and how the event tracking model of the browser is something that GTM exploits in order to add its own event listeners economically to the document object model's top node, so that it can use event delegation rather than having to add the listener directly to every single element on the page. And we also talked about what the drawback of using this kind of event delegation model is, where other site JavaScript can actually block the propagation from happening, in which case GTM's own triggers will not work. And we talked about a couple of workarounds for this auto event tracking issue. Some resources going forward and taking the stuff you learned in this lesson. I wrote a chapter for eNor's Google Analytics Breakthrough book, which goes over the same kind of stuff we talked about here. It's in webinar format behind that link. And you can also get the book from Amazon. It's a useful book to have for Google Analytics development work. Dumb Enlightenment by Cody Lindley is one of the best books on the document object model. So if you're intrigued by how the browser renders the HTML document into this kind of dynamic JavaScript representation, this book is great. And it's actually open source, so it's in the link behind, in the link dumbenlightenment.com. You can find the book and read it right there and then. Or if you prefer a bound version, you can buy it off Amazon. And then finally, there's a CSS selector guide I wrote for Google Tag Manager. So the kind of hierarchy of things you need to learn for advanced GTM is JavaScript is number one, of course, but CSS selectors are a very strong second. So CSS selectors are what you would use with things like the JustLinks trigger, the all elements trigger, the form submission trigger, and the element visibility trigger. When you want those triggers to only fire for specific elements. Using CSS selectors, you can target any element on the page, regardless of what attributes it has. And that way you can achieve a huge amount of accuracy in your event tracking setups.
In this lesson, we covered topics like the data layer push, how it feeds events into Google Tag Manager's message queue, and how those events are processed in order by GTM to fire your tags and triggers. We talked about how Google Tag Manager uses auto event tracking to handle user interactions on the page and to handle the semantic information you package for GTM when the page loads. Now we'll take all this information and pass it on to the next lesson, where we'll be talking about custom event handlers and how you can build your own listener setups for interactions that Google Tag Manager doesn't natively offer you.